domestically, and before the advent of slavery, in which, as I put it here, neurophysiology meets culture. Somehow, reading or reinforced behavior or something, I'm not a psychologist and I don't think it's actually been very carefully investigated, starts kicking in and making this inborn possibility of empathy have to do some moral work. So the Romans had the same physiology we do. It just did something that made it bearable to them and not bearable to us. So what I'm going to try to do is, what is it that happens that makes it happen? And we already know that it did happen. And we have real concrete evidence of people saying this and thinking it's new. And so we have some bits of the evidence here already. We have a sense of a physiology, and we have a sense of a certain sort of narrative, of learning that makes us think, well, they are like us. This is gruesome. We should get pleasure in this. This is the opposite. Okay? So let's go. That's this sort of general background setting. Now, the people of the 18th century understood, the theorists of this, understood that this is actually, that what they're being asked to feel for people at a distance is actually a problem. Let me give you an example from someone you've all heard of, the great theorist of capitalism, Adam Smith. Adam Smith said the following. He said, if I were to lose a little finger tomorrow, I were told I was a little finger tomorrow, I couldn't sleep tonight. But provided I never saw them, I could sleep perfectly well, knowing that hundreds of millions or thousands of my brethren far away were to die. So there's some sense in which you lose your little finger is going to be a big deal for you. Well, you might feel bad that people are going to die somewhere in distance, but you're probably not going to lose a lot of sleep about it. And I just gave you one other version of this. The great French Enlightenment figure, Diderot, used the example of a Chinese mandarin. Again, he said, if I lose my little finger, I'm going to lose sleep over it. If the greatest scholar in China were to lose their life, I would feel bad, but it's not going to have a big effect. So the notion is, the problem then with this, at a distance they understood, is that it's problematic. And it's probably rightly problematic, because you do want a world in which we care for people that are near and dear for us. One of the criticisms of humanitarianism throughout the ages and still today is that humanitarians care more for people at a distance than they care for people close to them. That's the standard parody of the humanitarian. So the theorists at the origins of humanitarianism understood this. And people today understand. I mean, people who think about suffering understand this. Primo Levi, the great witness at Auschwitz, you're going to read some of him later in the course, says the following. There's no proportion between the pity we feel and the extent of the pain by which pity is aroused. If we're able to suffer the sufferings of everyone, we could not live. Perhaps the dreadful gift of pity for many is granted only to saints. And of all of us, there remains, in the best of cases, only this sporadic pity addressed to the single individual, the mitmensch, the co-man, the human being of flesh and blood standing before us, within the reach of our providentially myopic senses. So Levi is saying that, look, in fact, it would be unbearable if we actually felt the suffering of the whole world. And in fact, maybe all we could do is feeling the suffering of the people that are just around us. But what I want to talk to you about today, then, is the creation of a larger category of what he called mitmensch, the fellow human. What I've called earlier the circle of the we. So we can't bear the suffering of everyone, but we can start feeling and wanting to do something about the suffering more generally. So, now let's talk about why this happens. And I want to talk about the narrative expansion of the we, and I want to use the example of slavery. And this is going to get out of communications and all the things that we mentioned earlier on. So I've just put now here a brief chronology of this anti-slavery. You don't need to take this down now. It'll be on on television. It's already there. So don't, and it's nothing novel. I mean, I'm not claiming any originality for this list, but I just want to go through it so you have a sense of what actually happens in the world, which I'm using as my not so much evidentiary base, but as the examples to which I would talk to you about this expansion of the idea of mid-range. So there's been arguments against slavery for all time, not just in the West, but in many other countries as well. So it's a long tradition of saying that slavery is wrong. But basically, slavery exists everywhere in the world in 1700, and not much is being done about ending it. So that's the starting point. And it's a big deal. And as you know, slavery in the New World is a really big deal. Something on the order of 12 million Africans were transported to the New World. This is not inconsequential. And ending this is not inconsequential. So I want to talk to you about how a major, something that's existed for a very long time, which is deeply imbricated in the political economy of the world, it's come to be seen as illegitimate and ends, and how a humanitarian organization works at doing this, and why they feel they should do it. So that's a little background. So I want to begin with the beginnings of organized abolitionism is really in America, in the American colonies, and it's in Philadelphia, and it's with the Quakers. And with the Quakers, it does grow out of a religious feeling. The Quakers, you know, believe in a kind of inner light which illuminates all of us, illuminates our moral and spiritual lives. And that inner light began speaking to a group of Quakers saying that we can't bear living with slavery. So the origins, the significant majority of people who founded American abolition societies in the late 1770s were Quakers. And Quakers actually, even before the society, made it not owning slaves a condition for being a member of Quaker meetings. Second, so I'm just going to do this very fast, and you can wiki these, okay? This is not deep. This is just a little background. Second important thing is in 1772, and I mention this because it's mentioned, I think not in your version of the Dred Scott, but it's mentioned in the full version of the Dred Scott case, which you guys read, which is a case of a slave named Somerset, who is brought to England, and who manages to escape from his master and actually get on a British vessel, which is in harbor, which is like a part of Britain, and then says he can't be enslaved because Britain, you can't be a slave in Britain, even if you were purchased somewhere as a slave before. And in this decision, Lord Mansfield's decision in 1772, Mansfield holds that the condition of slavery is incompatible in England with English law. He cites Magna Carta. I mean, Magna Carta there were serfs at the time of Magna Carta, but he cites a whole long tradition in which the condition of serfdom, of unfree labor, is stripped away in this historical tradition I talked to you about. So by 1772, you couldn't be an unfree laborer. Crudely put. So slavery is just not compatible with the depth of English law. A case very shortly after this makes the same thing in Scotland, which is a slightly different legal situation, but that's not important. The important thing is that people come to believe that there is something about English law which says that slavery in England or on English boats, which will be important a bit later, is not possible. 1887, the founding of the first anti-slavery committee, which is going to be the committee which is pushing through the legislation that eventually abolishes the slave trade. And one of its founders is Thomas Clarkson, who we read of, and his tract, A Summary of the View of the Slave Trade, is based on this, Eat Your Hearts Out, his undergraduate thesis, which he wrote in Latin in 84 and won a prize, and then translated in 85 into English. So this really is something where student activism makes a big difference in the world. 89, the narrative that you read part of, the narrative of Equiano, is written, which becomes, it's a quasi-novel. I mean, all right, and it's very much in the first person, as you know. And this is pushed by the Anti-Slavery Society, becomes a bestseller. In fact, he's very involved in bringing some of the important people into the anti-slavery movement. But in any case, they now have a book speaking to the communications issue, right? Which is a bestseller. It's printed again and again. Equiano is a Methodist. It does really